Hello, my name is Keith, and this is a series of videos about healthy living. And if you like these videos, I ask you to subscribe on this YouTube channel, Get Healthy Now. This video was created during the Mayor's Fitness Challenge, where communities would compete against each other to be deemed the most fit city. And each week we included a video to provide health education during the challenge. This one is titled Stress, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Angelica Keene is the presenter.
All right. Thank you for that, Keith, and welcome to the stress management, the good, the bad, the ugly. My name is Angelica Keene, and I work for the University of Florida Extension Office. So my role is to bring evidence-based education to the community. My areas of expertise is health and wellness, specifically this area of like mindfulness, stress management, and kind of this thing. So when Keith presented this opportunity, I jumped at it. So before I share my screen and dive into the presentation, I want to make sure that everybody has kind of this core understanding of kind of the functionings of the brain, because that ties into what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to use the hand model to kind of introduce you to the concept of your brain. So as the name states, you're going to use your hand, and you can do this with me or you can just watch, it's up to you, to kind of indicate the different portions of your brain. So if you're looking at my hand right here, or you've got your hand in front of you, your wrist area is what we refer to as your spinal cord. And your spinal cord is what supports your brain. It is your connective tissue that sends all the signals all throughout your entire body. Your palm of your hand is what we refer to as the inner brainstem. Okay. And then your thumb is what we call the midbrain or the amygdala. And if you were to cross your finger across your thumb, you get what they call is the limbic system. Sometimes this also commonly people talk about it as the downstairs portion of your brain, and we'll get into that. So then your fingers are your cortex, and the very tips of your fingers are your frontal cortex. So if you were to bring those down, you have kind of this full completed brain. And as you can see, if you ever see a brain model, that's very similar to what it looks like. And this is important to understand and kind of dive into, because how does our body function on stress, and how our different portions of our brain function actually change versus if we're talking of the upstairs brain, which is this cerebral cortex area and this prefrontal cortex area, or the downstairs brain, which is our limbic system. So we're going to start talking about our downstairs brain. So in our downstairs brain, our limbic system, that's where we store all of our emotions, our memories, our survival actions. Specifically, kind of this like thumbnail area is the hippocampus, and that's where we create new memories. And so it's important to understand that this is our entire system. This downstairs system or downstairs brain or limbic system, you kind of use those all interchangeably, are responsible for assessing dangers, analyzing our situations, determining if we need to fight, flight, freeze. It sends all the kind of symbols and connected to our nervous system. It connects through that spinal cord to send those hormones, things like that. So, for example, if you were to get stung by a bee, your hippocampus would then send this signal that say, hey, this limbic system would send a system that says, hey, you've been stung. Your body would start to fire, and your hippocampus would remember and associate bees with fear. Now, when everything's functioning together, okay, when your upper brain and your downstairs brain are kind of all working in unison, this is what we call that moderate stress. And we're going to dive into exactly what that means later in this presentation, but this is the natural state. And so what happens here is that the upstairs brain is your logic, your creative thinking, your problem solving. It analyzes things from that linear and logical perspective. So when your upstairs brain and your downstairs brain are functioning at its highest point, that's when you have control of your emotions. That's when you can evaluate your feelings. That's when that fight or flight situation happens, but you react in a moderate sort of way. So using this example of the bee sting, you got stung by a bee, you remember you didn't enjoy it. So the next time you see a bee, you might kind of move away. It's not this overreaction where it's like you see a bee and you scream and run 20 miles. Okay. That would be a bit extreme, but it's this idea that these two portions of your brain, your upstairs brain and your downstairs brain, function as one whole unit. And what happens when we get into this state of chronic stress, and we'll dive into more of what that means, but what happens is you flip your lid. And and the funny thing about that is it's actually physiologically kind of what happens. So how many of you guys have ever had a situation where you get super mad or angry, and the next thing you know, you're just reacting, and you stop and then you pause later and you're like, maybe that reaction wasn't my best, right? Show of hands if anybody's ever done that before. Okay, that's referred to flipping your lid. And what happens is this part of your brain, your logic part of your brain, actually disconnects. It doesn't stop working, but it's no longer where all the neurons are firing. And so that's where the analogy of flipping your lid comes from, because the only part that's got any active activity is this downstairs system that only works on reactions and memory. And it's not really taking any new information in. Okay. And this is important to understand because this is how our brain functions no matter what. And so that plays a huge portion into stress itself. So I'm going to pause there and go ahead and share my screen. Okay.
You got it.
Okay, perfect. Everybody seeing my screen? Excellent. Let me quick. There. Okay. So again, looking at the stress management from this concept of the good, the bad, the ugly. So today's objectives to kind of thing was to understand the brain. And that's what we did earlier with this kind of hand exercise. We're also going to talk about what are stressors and how that contributes to stress in general. Identify how stress affects our body, like what are the effects of stress, and then kind of start to look at how do you individually recognize stress. So what is a stressor? A stressor is anything that causes that, again, that downstairs brain to fire. So it can be different for each person. It can be simple, it can be interactive, but again, each person's going to process things differently. And most people, when they think of stress, instantly think of stress as a problematic thing or a bad thing. But that is not the case, because as we've just kind of explained, that overall function is what your brain is supposed to do. Your body is supposed to do those things. So this idea of that stress is a bad thing it's only bad if it becomes chronic. In this moderate level of stress, that is actually a really good thing, because it means our body is doing what it's supposed to do. And actually what they're finding is this moderate level of stress actually is really positive, because the research shows that it helps brain function. It helps increase alertness, performance. It actually stimulates growth cell in your brain. It actually creates new memories, neurons, and pathways. So stress is actually a consistent workout, for kind of a lack of a better way, but it's a way that your brain kind of gets an extra workout in. And so it actually is a really good thing. It's all about how long you stay in that stressful state and how you choose to perceive each situation. So for example, it's another reason to think about it as a good thing is when everything's functioning, your upper brain and your lower brain and your downstairs brain is functioning at the same rate, at the same level, your lid hasn't been flipped. If you were, say, an animal and you were to encounter a predator and you were able to escape and run away, both areas would be functioning. You would have new memory pathways, and you would actually be able to interpret the information, analyze the information, figure out what works. So it's the same for humans too. So how many of you guys have ever had to give a presentation, for example, and you got stressed, you got anxious, it turned out really well? What happens is that stress, that downstairs brain is reacting, it's sending all the blood flow, it's doing all these things it's supposed to do, but your upper brain or your cortex is actually analyzing that information. So you start to learn patterns. So what you've done in the past, you can do again in the future. And so that's where actually stress becomes a good thing. That's also where our habits are formed, and because it's analyzing that information consistently. The problem comes when we flip our lid and we get into too intense of a stressful situation and we stay in this flipped lid too long, and we actually start to lose that connection between the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And that's kind of what we refer to as chronic stress. And that's what we want to stay out of. So what are some things that cause stress? So at this point, you can unmute yourself and let me know what your thoughts are, or you can put it in the chat. And I know Keith has offered to be our chat monitor. So what kind of things cause you guys stress? Who would be willing to share?
I'll start out. Over the years as a social worker, I've been put in some pretty stressful situations. I've looked down the barrel of a gun. I've had an axe thrown at me, various things like that. That definitely causes stress.
For sure. Who else? And you don't have to give a specific example. It could just be a big, broad category too.
Project deadlines is one.
Definitely.
Family.
Yep.
I would add holidays or vacations.
For sure. Somebody give me one more.
Bills.
Bills.
I'm reading these off the chat. So.
Perfect. Thank you. So these are not all, but some big broad categories of causes of stress is that family, friends, relationships, money, like we talked about, large events, kind of group gatherings, public speaking, any sort of life event. And I say major life events because that's what people think of, but it can be even those smaller life events too, such as things breaking, you losing your keys. How many of we run around going, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And you're talking on it, because you're distracted and overwhelmed kind of thing. There's time pressures. And it is so anything that causes you to feel like you have a lack of that sense of control kind of thing. And again, what's important to understand here is that the common causes of stress, just like stress itself, is not a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing. What causes us stress can also be a good thing too. So for example, in these major life events, things like getting married, having babies, these can all be very positive things and positive influences on your overall life. But in short periods of time, or even just plannings or different things, they can become stressful because it's out of that consistency. But then you also have, friends and families. Like, I don't know about you, but I love when my family comes to visit. I am so excited every time an aunt, uncle, cousin, brother is coming over, but there's also stress involved, and I'm glad to see him leave sometimes too. So it's, again, that all of these things can be both good and bad. It's how we choose to perceive each situation, and then what we choose to do about that information that we're looking into, and understanding that it's not, stress is a good thing unless it's chronic or toxic. So we want to get away from this kind of mindset of stress is bad. All stress is bad. My family coming over, I'm so stressed. This is so bad. We want to reframe that. This is really good. I'm going to have a good experience. I'm going to learn from it. Maybe it's something like you learn to set better boundaries. with your family or friends. Maybe it's you know, like people talk about having children. I personally haven't had any, but I've seen from my sister-in-law who has 6 that her first kid was extremely stressful. By the 6th, she was like, shh, I got this. Like, because she's learned, she adapted, she grows, her body did what it was supposed to do in these stressful situations. She interpreted the information, she came up with patterns, and she got better at it. And so that's kind of how we want to start thinking about stress. Okay, so getting into how does stress specifically affect our body? So how stress specifically affects our body in this moderate level, it does all those things that we talked about. This downstairs brain really starts to connect through that spinal cord and send all of hormones. You guys heard them talk about cortisone, which is one of the common stress hormones. There's a number of different hormones that it actually sends through. And what these hormones do is it does things like, in short terms, it improves your senses, makes you hyper aware of a situation. It increases your perspiration. Your muscles tense, which is actually a good thing, because if you were, say, walking down a dark alley and you heard a noise and you weren't sure what it was and you needed to run away, you would need that blood to flow to those muscles so that you could run as quickly as possible. It does things like sends chemicals to help clot the blood faster, which again, if you were to fall down the hill, cut your leg hiking, but you had to hike back, that type of like stress and adrenaline and things would kick in and help your blood to clot so that you wouldn't, of course, depending on how bad the wound is, but, smaller wounds would kind of clot and quit bleeding on their own. It also blunts your pain. So it allows you, if you have, again, fallen down that hill, you sliced your leg, it's hurt, but you need to get back to your car. You're not necessarily as aware of how intense it is until you get relaxed and calm down. And your pupils dilate. And again, these are all good things. This is what our body is supposed to do. In this moderate stress, it actually connects with our immune system and supports it and gets it firing. And it is a very healthy, positive response. Again, though, that's if we stay in this moderate stress level. If we start continuously staying in this and we don't do things to manage our stress, identify when we are stressed, then we become chronically stressed. And chronic stress is what everybody talks about with those very negative consequences. So some negative consequences of chronic stress is cardiovascular damage. So as I said, when you're in that moderate stressful situation, it sends those chemicals to help clot your blood, which is great on a temporary basis. But on long term, what happens is it actually starts to damage and inflame your blood vessels. And what that does is that actually causes the plaque to kind of stick along the wall, which can do things like give you the high blood pressure, can left too long, can lead to, heart attacks, disease, things like that. So we want to make sure we're kind of watching that. Also, the longer we stay in stress and we don't do things to bring ourselves down once our lid fully flips, to keep us in this calm state, to connect to the two functions of our brain again, it becomes harder for us to identify when we're stressed and when we're not stressed, which leads into this just natural state of fatigue all the time. We're just always tired and we're not sure why. How many of you guys have ever had a week where you got a good 8-9 hours of sleep, but you wake up and you feel more tired than you did going to bed? Okay, it's because there's lots of factors here, but one thing is if you're in that chronic stressed state, you're never getting that kind of deep rest. And of course, sleep is affected, but so it leads to this fatigue. Same thing with that blood flowing temporarily to that muscle tension. That's fantastic. You're building those muscles, you're using them. It's doing all the things you're supposed to do. But if it stays in that heightened state, it actually starts to break down the muscle and actually wear away at it. So you now actually have less muscle tissue than you would have if you were able to regroup. And what they're finding now with more and more research is this chronic state of stress can actually lead to reproductive issues. And it could be as simple as, not having interest, or, kind of all the way to actually having difficulty conceiving. So there's a variety of different things. And so that's something to talk to your doctor about for sure, to kind of identify if that's something that you think may be an issue or a concern or something you want to address. So some other consequences of long-term stress, this chronic stress we're talking about, is type 1 diabetes. So what they found is that type 1 diabetes, the hormone that they send, that cortisone hormone, and that your brain frequently secretes other hormones to go along with it, but it actually causes your body to have it at this higher level, and it doesn't have time to process it out. And so what they're finding is this can actually lead to type 1 diabetes. In addition to that, when you're in that state of stress, you have your appetite gets either suppressed or increased, kind of depending on which way your body chooses to function, how you do it. So that can lead in itself to weight gain. If you eat too much, then you've got those extra calories coming in. If you eat too little, then you don't have the nutrients your body needs to function. And so you're either, gaining or losing. I don't know about you, but we saw it with the pandemic. How many people gained a pandemic 15? How many people lost a pandemic 15, kind of thing. And it happens on both sides. And when it happens too quickly, that's where we start to have problems. During that moderate stressful situation, it also, again, going back to that example where you're walking down the alleyway, you heard a noise and, you're running to your car, you don't want to have to stop and use the restroom. So your body actually shuts down the connective components to your digestive system, which is fantastic because, again, if you were being chased by a bear, do you think you'd have time to pause and go, "Excuse me, Mr. Bear, but I have to go potty"? It doesn't work that way. Okay. So we want that to happen, but when it becomes chronic, then you get the pendulum swing between constipation and diarrhea. Now, there can be many other causes, but what they're finding is that chronic stress can actually lead to kind of these worsening of symptoms, such as irritable bowel, constipation, diarrhea, gas, bloating, all of these things that, people struggle with. It can be associated with your gut health for sure, but it can also be a sign that your body's in this chronic stress state and that we need to do some things to bring it back to that balance, bring that lid back down, connect those pieces again so that everything is functioning and firing in its highest quality. In short terms, like we talked about, the memory becomes heightened, but just like any muscle, when your muscle starts to deteriorate from overuse, same thing happens to your memory. You start to actually lose some of those connectives. And then sleep. We've all talked about sleep being so important to your overall health. And if you're stressed, your mind races and you can't sleep. And so that becomes very problematic. So how do you know when you're stressed? How do you identify stress? So this is important to understand, to realize that how you identify stress, what happens specifically. So all of those things I talked about earlier, about the responses, the blood, the eyes dilating, the pupils, the muscle responses, those are unconscious. Our bodies do those naturally. We're completely unaware of that. But what we can be aware of is there are these symptoms that kind of come with our stress that we can observe. Now, it's not to say if you have these symptoms, it means for sure you're stressed, because as you can see, a lot of these symptoms are also caused by a lot of other things. If you've worked out, if you've eaten food that is bad, if you have, been talking a lot and now you got a sense of dry mouth and you need to take a sip of water, you sweat during a workout. So there's lots of things that can also cause these types of symptoms. But if we become aware, and again, everything's firing like it should, and we're taking in that information, you can actually start to recognize what's stress versus what's not. And what they find is that, in fact, only about 5% of the population actually can tell the difference between when they're just having one of these symptoms caused by something else, or if it's specifically caused by stress. And that's very sad, 5%. That means 95% of us are walking around no idea if we're in a chronic stress state or if we're functioning at our highest. And so kind of learning what symptoms work for you and what symptoms you recognize really helps. And there is a ton of resources and kind of tests and scales and journaling that kind of help you to identify it. And here's just a few more of kind of lists of options of symptoms of things. At this point, before we continue, does anybody recognize any of the symptoms either on the last list or this list that they know are signs of them being stressed? And you can share in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
I know for me, it's my jaw. It always gets tightened when I'm in the stressful, and I'm observant of that. So when I recognize that, that's when I know I need to calm down. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I get cranky and impatient.
Yep. Okay.
For me, I think it's problems sleeping, where I just can't get in that restful place, you know, where my mind just doesn't necessarily shut off. It just keeps going and going and going. And, you know, what do you really do at 2-3 o'clock in the morning? You know? Not much. So yeah. That's how I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, sorry. I have a lot, you know, several of the different examples, but feeling overwhelmed, I guess, is, you know, a real key, and that causes a lot of the other issues.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Right. And the idea is that the more you can become aware, like Keith's example, if he clenches his jaw, I know for me, my shoulders start to tense. They don't necessarily creep up all the way to my neck, which would be great because then everybody would know I was stressed and they could be like, hey, calm it down. But they like tighten back. And so they tense up really, really tight. And so I have to work on being aware of where are my shoulders. And so I know that as they start to clench, if I'm not doing a shoulder exercise, they don't do that normally. So for me, that's a really good way to go, okay, I know my body. I need to do some techniques that actually calm down and moderate the stress and kind of thing. So the more you can kind of tie in and really evaluate what you're feeling, how you're feeling, and then analyze the situation around you. Because again, just because you're having some or all of these symptoms, again, the fatigue, that could just literally be headaches, sinuses, racing pulse, muscle tension, stomach discomfort could be caused by something you ate. You know, if you have food sensitivities, again, talking too fast can be that sense of nerves. Hives can be itching or reaction to foods, to allergens, but it can also be to stress, okay? Emotional eating. You don't necessarily have to be just stressed to dive into that emotional eating, either by too much or too little, okay? You know, that worry, anxiety can be a stress related. It could be part of, you know, some deeper psychological things that, you know, kind of you need to work on. So it's completely saying that these could be signs of stress, but the only person that's going to be able to tell you that is you. And so understanding that you have to figure out what works for your body. And once you start to sense that pattern of, hey, I'm stressed here. Again, remember we talked about when the upper brain and that downstairs brain is functioning together, it is constantly analyzing that situation and it's picking up on all of those patterns for you so that, you know, when you start to have these signs, symptoms, and cues again in a same situation, then you have your ability to go, okay, wait, I know I'm stressed. Okay, now I need to do something about it. So we're actually going to, that's actually what we're talking about next week in my presentation, is talking about, hey, I recognize I'm stressed. I know these signs or symptoms. Now, what do I do with that information? I know I need to do something. So next week, we're actually going to dive into tangible, proven ways to help reduce your stress when you get in that kind of like overwhelmed situation, and some ways to kind of incorporate into best practices into hope to not get so stressed. So again, stress isn't a bad thing. It is a good thing. It is your body working the way it is supposed to. We need that to happen. We want that to happen. It's that chronic stress. It is that never getting out of that state. That lid has been flipped and we just always stay in this overwhelmed function where only our downstairs brain is really controlling things. We want to get back to that state and learn to stay in this state where our stress always stays in this good stress, because both are functioning at the same time. So we're analyzing our information, our situation, we're problem solving, but we're reacting to threats, concerns, information appropriately. Okay. So next week, like I said, in next week's presentation, I'm going to be diving into how to handle the stress. But I wanted to pause here because I want you guys to spend this week, or anybody watching it, if you're watching videos back to back in this recording, take a day or two and start to look back on the symptoms list. Okay. And kind of think about, when you get stressed, what do you feel? What do you sense? What do you notice happening in around you? Or ask your family. A fantastic way, if you're really not sure what you do when you're stressed, ask your friends or family, because they'll tell you. Like, most of the time, like I said, only 5% of the population is aware what they do when they're stressed, but we are far more observant about what others do, because that's easier to process than to identify our own. So ask your friends and family, have those conversations, hey, when I'm stressed, what do you notice I'm doing? Do I eat too much? Do I get cranky? Do I not sleep? Do I talk more? Do I talk less? Kind of thing. And they won't necessarily be able to describe those body symptoms to you, but my husband knows with my shoulders that when I get so stressed, they get so tight and so kind of clenched. You can see it actually in my neck. And so because of how tight I'm straining those shoulder muscles, so he even recognizes when I'm about to flip it completely, because my neck muscles start to really flare, and it's like, oh, okay, we need to stop, regroup, use some of the techniques that we're going to cover next week. So again, if you are going to join us next week, please do. If you're watching this recording, take a day or two and kind of think about your body, think about what symptoms you notice, so that you can start to use these techniques in the most effective way. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Anybody have, and we're going to open it up for any questions, comments, concerns, stories, examples, anything anybody wants to share with us. Yep, the video is going to be posted, and I actually have a checklist. I didn't think to bring it, but if you're interested, put your email in the chat and I'll pull those real quick, or we can pull those from the recording, Keith, correct?
Right, I can pull them down from the recording.
Yep, if you were interested, I can actually send you a checklist that actually is all of those symptoms, and you can kind of track and check to help you identify. So if you're interested, go ahead and drop your email in the chat and we can add that. And if you're watching the recording and you're interested, please email me. My email is, I'll put it back up on the screen real quick. Yep, so you can email Keith or you can email me directly. Either way, I'll make sure to share the list with him as well so that you can access that. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, stories you would like to share, things like that?
I just really just wanted to say this was a very helpful presentation for the information that you went over. Don't really have a story, but just good to know and think about, you know, what can trigger
Mhm.
stress, and then the best way to not let it overtake you to where you almost kind of feel, I think overwhelming was what somebody was saying, and
Mhm.
that leaves you in a powerless state where then you feel like you have no control in anything. So to, you know, to identify those stressors early on, you can kind of catch them before I think you would get into something where it takes a lot more energy to get yourself out.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Fantastic summary. Generally, when we talk about stress, we only talk about techniques to manage stress, and that is fantastic and very key and important. But if we don't identify the stressors or the symptoms at the beginning, then our management becomes a whole lot harder. It's like, you know, if you catch an illness quickly and you go to bed and you take your medicine and you get your rest, you heal a lot quicker. It's the same with stress, because again, we want our brain functions in this moderate sort of way, and stress is a good thing. It's when we flip our lid and we stay in this chronic stressed state when we start to have consequences. Okay, hearing and seeing kind of no other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and stop the recording right there. If you would